at great personal risk to himself and to Mrs. Sartre. And later, during the Cultural Revolution, he led the embassy in Peking, as it then was, when it was besieged by the Red Guards. And it was everyone who was there at that time remembers his calm, determined, and his strong leadership, which actually saw them through the crisis and saw India and China through that crisis as well. He, as Ambassador Devray reminded us, he was a pioneer of economic diplomacy. He was also one of the first to recognize the importance of energy and energy diplomacy. As I remember, because he persuaded me in the late 70s to go and work for the Department of Atomic Energy when that was hardly fashionable. But in all this, he was guided by a very strong vision of an India that would be powerful, but that would use power wisely, in the sense of serving a higher moral purpose. His was a deeply felt patriotism of the heart, of the mind, but he didn't wear it on his sleeve. And it was his strong moral sense that led him to emphasize that India must be transformed so that poverty, illiteracy, disease become things of the past. The common thread that ran through his beliefs and his career was also a very deeply held conviction that India shared a common destiny with her neighbors. His own career reinforced this because he spent long periods living and working in our neighborhood. He was in Iran, in Afghanistan. He was in China 4 times, beginning with the end of World War II, the Civil War, then in Kashgar in the early 50s and the 60s in Cultural Revolution China, and then again as ambassador in the late 70s. When it came to the neighborhood, in the early 80s, opinion in MEA was very deeply divided when the Bangladeshis proposed that we should set up a South Asian economic regional forum. There were those who felt that India should not join or encourage the formation of an organization which would become a forum for our smaller neighbors to unite against us. And this group's preference was that we continue to deal with each one separately and bilaterally. But Ram Sathe was among those who argued against this, who thought this was short-sighted and counterproductive because it would destroy trust and the possibility of all of us working together on the issues that face us, on issues like poverty and development. So he, along with others, argued strongly that so long as it was not allowed to degenerate into a political talking shop for the airing of bilateral disputes and had a clear economic and social agenda and a mandate, a regional forum should be useful. And fortunately, this was the view that prevailed, and the result was the creation of SAARC in the form that we know it today. It's now 28 years since Ram Sathe was Foreign Secretary of India, and 9 years since he passed away. So given his commitment to our relationships with our neighbors in South Asia and the extended neighborhood, I thought it might be interesting to see whether he would be surprised by what he would see of our relationship with our neighborhood today. Looking at our overall situation, I don't think he would have been surprised by the way that the Indian economy has developed or by its much greater role in India's foreign and internal policies. Nor do I think he would have been much surprised by India's present influence and status in the world. He was always a believer in both. Today, India is one of the major powers with influence in the region and an interest in global issues which affect our future in this interdependent and globalized world. But what would he think of our relations with our immediate neighbors? Today, we live in a paradoxical neighborhood, because South Asia is an economic success story, but is far less so in terms of politics, whether within or between the states in the subcontinent. We are, of course, one of the economically least integrated regions in the world. Less than 5% of our foreign trade is with each other within the subcontinent, despite all the effort that we have put into building a South Asian free trade area where our goods have mutual duty-free entry into each other's markets, and the non-reciprocal tariff concessions that India has extended to all her immediate land neighbors, including Pakistan, despite the lack of reciprocity. We have FTAs with Bhutan, with Nepal, Sri Lanka, and we've extended duty-free access to most products from Bangladesh now. And if you read the Indian media today, you get a picture of an India that is encircled and hemmed in by what they describe as a rising tide of extremism, political crisis, and so on around us. But I think that this kind of negativism and this negative narrative that you hear all the time actually misses what is really happening in the subcontinent, in all its complexity, its dynamism, and its variation, both in political and economic terms. We've been written off, we and many of us in South Asia have been written off as basket cases or worse in the past. But if you look at it, the subcontinent has not only survived, but is showing remarkable economic vitality. While the world has undergone the worst recession since the Great Depression in the 1930s, South Asia's economic growth has steadily outperformed all but China. To some extent, the continuing growth of the Indian economy has helped smaller South Asian economies to grow during such a deep global recession. And besides, the official figures only reveal a small part of the real story of economic exchanges in the subcontinent. Take Pakistan as an example. Our official two-way trade is of the order of $2 billion a year. But if you add what goes through third countries, then it's probably more in the region of $6 billion a year. And its potential, according to a recent study by Nisha Taneja of ICRIER, is probably around $19.3 billion a year. Think of that, 2, 6, 19.3. And I'm convinced that we also underestimate what we do with each of our other neighbors. And the reality of economic interdependence is actually much more than is admitted by the official figures. You broaden the vision and you notice that no other region in the world actually has as much in common in terms of language, culture, religion, popular affinity as South Asian countries do. Not Southeast Asia, not Western Europe, which are often held up as examples to us of regional integration. But these affinities, the economic interdependence, do not translate into easy political relations. So why this paradox? The explanation is simple. It actually flows from our common past, because historically speaking, the peoples of the Indian subcontinent are products of an ancient, shared past civilization and geography. But the states of the subcontinent are relatively recent inventions, and some of them are somewhat unfinished structures. Hence the vehemence in the political manifestations which we hear, which do not reflect the affinities that we share. And the result is this paradox between intent and reality, which of course is not unique to us in South Asia. But looking around South Asia today, it's only small fringe groups that argue openly against cooperation and the benefits of peace. The spread of democracy, the beginnings of economic interdependence, and most important, political and social consciousness of the benefits of peace are evident and recognized throughout South Asia. And yet, the objective fact is that some conflicts linger, and in some cases, seem to have even achieved an equilibrium or momentum of their own, whether in Afghanistan or in Pakistan's northwest and west, in cross-border terrorism, or the Rohingya issue or others. It's therefore essential that we study and think through this paradox and find new approaches to deal with these conflicts, whether between states, within them, or between states and non-state actors. Let's look at, in some individual relationships in the subcontinent, beginning maybe with Pakistan. Here again, the ease and the naturalness of contact between Indians and Pakistanis as individuals is hardly reflected in state-to-state relations. We in India have our reasons, the most important being cross-border terrorism from Pakistan, exemplified by Pakistani inaction on bringing the perpetrators of 26/11 to justice. Today, Pakistan herself is the target of terrorist violence by groups that have been nurtured and allowed a free run and support for far too long. There are also other issues, but beyond the issues themselves, there is today fatigue in the Indian public about the constant effort that normalizing relations with Pakistan seems to entail. In Pakistan, however, there is growing recognition that trading and economic relations with India are in Pakistan's interest. But the recognition that Pakistan can use her geographic location to encourage transit trade and benefit from transit trade between India and Central Asia and Afghanistan is still not come. More significantly, there should be a common interest among all states in our region to ensure that the security and political transitions in Afghanistan in 2014 go smoothly. In fact, Pakistan should worry that the same legitimization that she seeks for the Afghan Taliban in Afghan politics does not tomorrow take place with the TTP or the Pakistani Taliban in Pakistan. But this is still not apparent in action. So Pakistan, sadly, is a case where despite consistent efforts by present and previous Indian governments, relations remain strained and issues are unresolved. Fortunately, Pakistan is the exception among our neighbors. With every other neighbor, we can say that our relationship today is better than it was 10 years ago, that the elements for further improvement are in place or identified, and that both governments have shown the will to improve relations through concrete steps. Take Bangladesh, for instance. There's an active civil society, real mass-based political parties, a popular commitment to democracy, and most important, an alternative to extremist ideologies and a strong and vibrant Bengali culture and identity. The ongoing spontaneous gathering against extremist elements and war criminals by thousands of youth at Shehbag intersection in Dhaka shows the strength of feeling, the capacity for political mobilization, and the open-mindedness of Bangladeshi youth. As a democracy, Bangladesh has made great economic progress and has acted decisively against criminals, extremists, and Indian insurgents who sought to use Bangladeshi territory. So over the last few years, we have put in place a comprehensive framework of cooperation with Bangladesh, which includes cooperation in power, transport, duty-free access for Bangladeshi goods to India, opening border hearts, and trilateral cooperation with Nepal and Bhutan. So Bangladesh now awaits our actions to settle a land boundary once and for all and to agree an interim sharing of the Tista waters. But the relationship has truly been transformed in the last few years. With Nepal too, the relationship is growing, even while Nepal is preoccupied with her own difficult double transition, mainstreaming the Maoists and writing a constitution for a new republic. Neither of these is easy by itself, and the consequences of failure in either of these attempts will affect us in India directly. So our task is really to help to the extent that Nepal wants us to. In Sri Lanka, it's still a very complex situation. The civil war has ended militarily, but the hard political work remains to rebuild, rehabilitate a multi-ethnic society destroyed by 27 years of civil war. While the resettlement of the internally displaced seems to be continuing and is largely complete, but a lasting settlement really requires a political dispensation in which all the communities feel comfortable. This is an attempt in which we have been trying to help Sri Lanka since the early 80s, and the present opportunity really needs to be taken by all the communities in the country. but whether they will do so seems less and less certain. As a good neighbor who's directly affected, we will certainly attempt to help the process of reconciliation and rebuilding trust. Our largest neighbor is China, and the rise of China is probably the major geopolitical event of our times, but it has happened in a very different way from the rise of previous powers in the international system. While China is rising, so are other Asian countries like India, Indonesia, Korea, within an already crowded Asian balance of power. And China is linked to the rest of the world, to the US, to others, for her own economic growth and development. We, of course, are not the only power affected by the rise of China. Like the others, we have chosen to build on cooperative elements in our relationship with China while trying to solve difficult bilateral issues like the boundary and transboundary rivers, and to embed China in positive international relationships. There are elements of both competition and cooperation in our relations with China. To oversimplify, we have economic complementarity, and China is our largest trade partner in trade in goods, with over $80 billion of trade last year. We also have a fair amount of congruence in our approach to major global issues, such as climate change or energy security. But at the same time, we have major bilateral issues, the world's largest boundary dispute. But India and China have displayed the ability to manage differences and to work on what is common to both of us. The India-China border remains peaceful. Dealing with this complex set of issues in our relationship with China will probably be the greatest test of our diplomatic and strategic skills in the immediate future. But what about our extended neighborhood, the Indian Ocean, West Asia, Southeast Asia? For India, embedded as we are in the Indian Ocean, maritime security is critical to our future. Our maritime policies will be a major determinant of success or not in our attempt to transform India. And history shows that India was most prosperous and secure when she was most connected to the world, and this was largely by sea. The three major maritime imperatives of trade, energy, and security affect our foreign policy in several ways, and the Indian Ocean is already center stage in international politics. When you think of the issues that have concerned us in the recent past, whether the attack on Mumbai, the end of the Sri Lankan civil war, piracy off the Horn of Africa, the rise of China, domestic political turmoil now in the Maldives, the so-called Arab Spring, energy security and trade, instability in our periphery, each of them has involved the Indian Ocean or its littoral countries in one way or the other. There is a much clearer recognition today within the government of India of the importance of the maritime factor, and our active quest for stronger, deeper ties with Indian Ocean littorals like Myanmar, Iran, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Oman, and others is proof of this, as is the active naval diplomacy that we've undertaken. As for West Asia, there is no other region which impinges on our energy security with as much immediacy as West Asia. You know the facts. Over 6.5 million Indians live and work in the Gulf. They constitute they're the largest single concentration of the Indian diaspora abroad. They also constitute the largest expatriate community in some of these countries. They send home over $35 billion worth of remittances every year, and we get about more than 63% of our oil and gas from the region. It's also a major factor in our food security because we get phosphatic and other fertilizers from the region, and our major maritime lines of communication carrying our westward trade, our energy supplies pass through the region. And we share common cause with the people of the region in fighting extremism and terrorism. So it seems to me that the turmoil that we've seen recently in West Asia actually poses short-term challenges, but may actually also offer long-term opportunities to us. The challenges, I think, are evident. Everybody knows. They include the space that domestic changes in several countries have opened up for extremist groups and to pursue their own agenda. They include possible regional instability, the sectarian divide that seems to be opening up. They also include the disruptions and dislocations that accompany such processes of fundamental change. But the opportunities are maybe less easily evident. But in the long run, what we could be seeing could result in the people of West Asia taking control of their own destinies and choosing their own futures and leaders. And we in India have strongly supported democratic aspirations of the people, but we don't support externally enforced change. We've called for restraint in the use of coercive measures within the societies, but we're also clear that societies cannot be reordered from the outside. As recent experience shows, external interventions have uncertain and unstable outcomes. Instability radiating out of Libya into the Sahel region with spillover effects in Mali is an obvious example, and the prolonged conflict in Syria, both of which affect the wider region, are examples of what we now have to face. So what we are facing now, actually, beyond the specific situations in individual countries, whether Syria, Libya, and so on, is much deeper and longer-term change. The changes in the world energy scenario, for instance, and its geopolitical effects. What effect will the West's diminished reliance on Middle East oil have? The demographics, the political role of religion, these are big issues which I hope your center will be studying. In Southeast Asia, on the other hand, economic growth is strong, and we find an external environment that is much more conducive to India's own transformation. In sum, I would say we live in a difficult neighborhood which is going through complicated political transitions, and we do have difficult issues to deal with. But, as I've tried to show, the picture is not entirely negative. So why does this matter? To us in India, it matters because it affects our ability to transform India into a modern, prosperous, and secure country for all its citizens. The situation in our neighborhood matters because it affects our security and our well-being. We are intimately connected with each of our neighbors. The same people are on both sides of our boundaries, speaking the same language, and most of these boundaries are open. Trade, smuggling, employment do not recognize these boundaries, nor do insurgents, extremists, and separatists. And these are the problems of intimacy, and we will have to manage them. But the primary goal of our foreign policy is to enable the domestic transformation of India, not empire, not dominion, not status, not revenge, none of these other goals that are so often bandied about in public discourse. We chose a goal of transforming ourselves and being good global citizens very early in the national movement, and that will have to stay our goal until we abolish mass poverty in India. And one big element of creating an enabling external environment is to have a peaceful periphery. Now, we can debate how to achieve that in present circumstances. What we have tried since the early 90s, irrespective of which political party is in power, has been to economically integrate with our neighbors, not to insist on reciprocity in our bilateral relations, and trying to negotiate solutions to the issues that divide us. And we've had some success in this, whether it's the Ganga Waters Treaty, the South Asia Free Trade Agreement, the Border Peace and Tranquility Agreements with China, other border CBMs, opening cross-LOC travel, Free Trade Agreement with Sri Lanka, the Framework Agreement with Bangladesh in 2011. This policy of good neighborliness has the merit of not penalizing and making enemies of ordinary citizens in our neighbors. It also creates economic interdependence, which could ameliorate the political tensions that I mentioned earlier. But it certainly does not provide an answer to internal crises in our neighbors or to the kind of hostility that cross-border terrorism represents. That requires a response which is holistic, going beyond diplomacy, but that is a topic for another whole lecture in itself, and since it goes to the limits of international relations. So, to end as I began, it seems to me that Ramsathe might have been disappointed that more was not achieved in our relations with our neighbors. But I think he would understand that it was not for want of effort by India. As we look forward to the uncertain world that you students will make and live in, it's even more necessary that we make the intellectual effort to understand the world around us. And that is why your initiative in setting up the Institute for International Studies, and to establish the Ramsathe Chair is so necessary and welcome. I wish you every success in this endeavor. Thank you very much.